everyone, I'm Jeffrey Smith with the Institute for Responsible Technology. And I'm going to share with you some information which is, in my opinion, one of the most significant threats to our planet and our future, an existential threat. In fact, in 8 out of 8 talks that I gave when we were able to travel and give talks, every audience rated it as, on average, a greater threat than climate change. And some of these conferences were very focused on the climate. However, there is a solution, and that's the good news. I want to tell you that at the beginning, because if I just tell you, oh, here's some more bad news, I might lose you at the beginning. I'm going to share with you a PowerPoint presentation, a couple of videos in here, and the good news at the end. The talk is called The Replacement of Nature with GMOs, the Next Existential Threat. I'd like you to take a photo of this page because there's 4 websites that you may want to access later on. There's no need for me to tell you about them now. I'll tell you about them later after you've had a sense of what it is that we're doing and how you may want to learn more or participate. So please take a photo of this page now. And now we're going to go on to the next slide. I'm going to start with a 3-minute film called The New Global Threat from GMOs. It puts into perspective the overall concept or concern about the dangers of genetically engineered organisms, particularly because of gene editing, where we can easily and inexpensively introduce new organisms at an incredibly unprecedented rate, and they don't go away once they're introduced into the environment. So I'll say enjoy this 3-minute film, but it'll be the alarm to wake us up to continue. So we'll play that now.
If we stop climate change, save our oceans, and protect our soils, we may still lose the natural world we cherish. A quiet invasion is underway, where companies who profit from altering DNA are declaring open season on all parts of nature. Like the gold rush of the Wild West, there is a global gene rush underway, moving from engineering crops to engineering entire ecosystems. From algae to animals, fungus to flowers, bacteria to bees. With genetic engineering techniques such as gene editing costing less than ever, nothing is off limits. Once released, GMOs reproduce. Artificial changes can spread through the environment and corrupt the gene pool. We have no strategies to clean it up. The only thing lasting longer than a permanently altered gene pool is extinction. Last century, the assault of synthetic chemicals polluted nature. Today's genetic assault could replace nature forever. What is the most common outcome of genetic engineering? Surprise side effects. It's not that individuals seek to permanently replace nature with unpredictable laboratory creations. It's thousands upon thousands of labs racing to get their invented organisms out there first. And many governments, including the US, Australia, Argentina, Brazil, and Japan, are eliminating regulations and safety precautions, hoping that GMO companies can make quick profits and dominate. On June 6th, the Trump administration proposed new rules that could make almost every GMO exempt from regulations by the Department of Agriculture. On June 11th, President Trump signed an executive order to further erode government oversight. In addition, it authorizes the US State Department, Trade Representative, and other agencies to work together to convince the world to accept GMOs, and by October 9th, have a strategy in place to use the maximum financial, political, and diplomatic pressure to arm twist the nations of the world into fully accepting America's GMOs. Do you think the citizens of the world will have something to say about that? We do. In fact, we invite you to join a global protest to say it loud and clear. It's time to blow the whistle, not just for our children and grandchildren, but for all living beings and all future generations. They're depending on us. Protect nature now.
So now that we've seen that genetic engineering can replace nature with a corrupted gene pool, what could possibly go wrong? Well, let's take a look at salmon. There's a company called Aqua Bounty that has genetically engineered salmon that grow quicker because they've inserted growth hormone genes and an on switch, so that instead of having the growth hormone switch on during part of the year, their genetically engineered salmon just grow constantly. So theoretically, they can get to market in 18 months instead of 3 years. They're expecting to sell the salmon in the United States as early as 2020, this year, or possibly next year. And so we want to know about it. When they did an assessment of the salmon for human safety, there was an allergic response that was 20 to 52% higher, but they used only 6 fish, so that wasn't statistically significant. If you want to hide evidence, then you use a lower number of subjects. They also found that a cancer-promoting hormone, IGF-1, was 40% higher. And in another test, they used such a poor device to test growth hormones, they couldn't find hormones in any fish, the GMO or not. And so they said, oh, there's no increase in the growth hormones in the fish. They did it by using a method that had a very low sensitive threshold. And so it was basically rigged research. They're not paying attention to the impact that this salmon may have on our health. So that's one level where the salmon, if introduced in the food supply, may cause cancer, may cause allergic responses and toxic responses, but we won't know because it's going on unlabeled, or it's not, especially in restaurants. Now, there was a study done with salmon that was similarly genetically engineered, not Aqua Bounty's particular variety. And when they allowed their genetically engineered salmon to swim in tanks that looked like the ocean, and there was sufficient food, it was no problem, whether they were just with the GMO fish or with the natural fish. But when the amount of food was reduced, the frankenfish freaked and started killing and eating neighbors because it was voraciously hungry, because it had that growth hormone going all the time. So you can imagine what might happen if this salmon were released into the ocean. It could end up causing population crashes or complete extinctions, or wiping out of other types of fish. There was another genetically engineered fish called a Medaka, a Japanese fish, and they found that when they genetically engineered it, there was a 70% survival rate of the offspring, but there was a mating advantage because the males, I think, were more attractive to the females. And so they just did a computer model with the actual traits that they found in the actual genetically engineered Medaka, and they put them into a computer model and found that when they added 60 GMO Medaka into a population of 60,000, to their shock and surprise, there was a complete extinction in 40 generations. Now, unfortunately, farmed salmon is not a safe alternative to release the GMO salmon. If they put it into farmed, caged areas off of the coast, up to 2 million farmed salmon escape each year in the North Atlantic alone. And I don't know what's worse, an extinction event from salmon, or these roving adolescent, aggressive, cannibalistic salmon destroying the balance of fish in the ocean. But you get an idea. You can't recall them once they're out. Now, Aqua Bounty doesn't plan on their side to use farmed salmon. They want to use tanks inland, but they're going to make the eggs available to people all over the world. And we don't have any control once it gets out of their hands. Another genetically engineered critter was the mosquitoes, produced by Oxitec. And they created a mosquito that was designed to mate and give birth to sterile offspring. And so they were going to release millions of them, and they did in 4 countries, Cayman, Panama, Malaysia, and Brazil, in order to drive down the population of this particular mosquito, and the Aedes aegypti, because that carried Zika and dengue. Now, they promised over and over again that as soon as they stopped releasing it, because all of the offspring were going to basically fade away because they're producing sterile offspring, that it would disappear from the environment. They promised that they were only going to release the males and not the females because the females bite. And it turns out they were lying. What a surprise. So they released billions of lab-grown mosquitoes, and it turns out they never tested the saliva of the mosquitoes, knowing that they were going to be releasing female mosquitoes and that there was at least a 3% survival rate. And in the presence of tetracycline, that can go up to 18%, which means that the offspring could include the females. And so they were releasing millions of females. They could give birth to millions of females. And when the female bites, the saliva gets into your bloodstream, and they never tested it. So they released millions of them in 4 countries. People were bitten, and they never tested that. I remember I was testifying, I think in 2014 in the Florida Keys, because the Florida Keys wanted to release these GM mosquitoes. I testified. Derek Nemo from Oxitec testified. I spoke to him in the lobby. I said, have you ever tested the saliva? And he said, well, we're just now testing to see if the gene that was inserted into the mosquito produces a protein that ends up in the saliva. And I'm thinking, it's a little late, Derek. You've released millions of them in 4 countries, exposing the population to your saliva. That's entirely irresponsible, but I didn't say that. Instead, I schooled him. I said, when you insert a gene into a genome, it can create massive collateral damage, and other genes can change their levels of expression. In a human gene, for example, let me share my face here. In a human gene, when they inserted a gene into a cell from someone that had cystic fibrosis, they were surprised to find that up to 5% of the naturally functioning genes changed their levels of expression. And this means that you don't just, I said, rather than testing just to see if the new gene creates a protein that's in the saliva, you can end up boosting the levels of existing allergens or toxins, or creating new allergens or toxins. I said, Derek, shouldn't you be testing the complete components of all of the saliva? And his response, which I'll never forget, was, good idea. I also argued with him. I said, I can't believe you guys are releasing these mosquitoes knowing that they can permanently change the gene pool. And he said, it won't, it'll completely die out. There's no question. And I explained what I tried to argue with him, and he was entirely, he was stubborn. But what we found out was when they tested the mosquitoes for 3 years after the Brazilian study, they found out that it did in fact contaminate forever the gene pool, and up to 60% of their samples had DNA, not just from the natural Brazilian mosquito, but the 2 sources of DNA in the genetically engineered mosquito. So they were creating kind of genetically engineered hybrids. And those hybrids could end up being more resistant to insecticides and may carry diseases more readily than the natural. They have no idea. They've never tested the qualities or characteristics, and it's permanent now. And in spite of all that, and in spite of our best efforts, the Mosquito Control Board in the Keys approved the release of 750 million genetically engineered mosquitoes. So we're still trying to stop it. It hasn't been released yet. It's set for early 2021. Now I'm going to share with you a trailer for another film. The film was going to be released in early 2021, and I want to show you a trailer right now.
You can buy a do-it-yourself gene editing kit from Amazon for $169 so you can alter bacteria in the comfort of your own home. The most common and consistent result from genetic engineering from the beginning has been surprise side effects. When you genetically engineer bacteria, algae, fungus, viruses, they can't be traced and they can proliferate easily around the planet.
All of those treatments where the genetically engineered bacterium had been present were dead.
We're talking about a real-world potential nightmare.
Just everything that exists in a terrestrial system would be slowly but surely destroyed as this bacterium moved out. So we were within 2 weeks of that genetically engineered organism being released. 2 weeks.
Looking at the ecological effect of a bacterium engineered this way, the logical consequence of releasing this to the real world would be that we would lose terrestrial plants.
It could theoretically change weather patterns.
There is an excellent possibility it will swap genetic information with the bacteria that reside in our gut.
COVID-19 is a glaring example of how microorganisms, whether genetically engineered or not, can quickly encircle the globe.
Once GMO bacteria are released, no policy can stop it.
There are companies now with facilities full of robots driven by artificial intelligence for massive release. What if 100,000 different strains are released in this generation? What if it's 1 million? All future generations are sentenced to inherit our mistakes.
The time we have to control these things is before you release them, and that is the only time.
It would have affected the whole world.
There was a genetically engineered bacterium, it was called Klebsiella planticola. Now, in its natural form, it is found on the roots of virtually every plant that they've tested. There was a bunch of scientists who had a well-intentioned idea to genetically engineer the Klebsiella so that it would turn plant matter into alcohol. And they wanted to distribute this to farmers who could mix their crop stubble, the leftover crop pieces that weren't harvested. Instead of burning them, they would mix them in big barrels with the genetically engineered bacteria, which would turn it into alcohol. They'd open a little spigot and they'd have alcohol to power their tractors or sell off the farm. And then they would have sludge at the bottom of the barrel, which they were going to be told to spread on their fields as fertilizer. And my friend Elaine Ingham was involved because her graduate student wanted to do a study on GMO organisms, genetically modified organisms. And here was bacteria that was being genetically engineered. And he said, oh, I'd like to do a research on it to use towards my PhD. And he did. It wasn't required because the EPA had given the green light for everything. And he took that sludge and he mixed it with soil and he planted some wheat seeds and they had controls. And one day on a Saturday morning, he went into the laboratory and found out that all of the little wheat plants that had grown slightly had turned to mush, slime on top of the soil. And he found out that the bacteria was still was still active. It was converting the plant matter to alcohol. Now, he discovered this, and so they canceled the plans to deploy the bacteria. They had planned to do a release of that bacteria in 2 weeks from the day he found that it killed his wheat plants. And they wanted to see how far it would spread. That was the big question before they sent it out all over the country. Well, Elaine Ingham was the graduate student's advisor, a professor at Oregon State University. She was told privately by some whistleblowers at the EPA that the EPA had already done this research. And they had taken a bacterium that was to fix nitrogen, a different type of bacteria, and we released it in a place in Louisiana, and they monitored how far it spread. It went about 11 miles in the first season, then 11 miles, then more and more. And they stopped funding the study, but there were some employees that continued to be interested, and at least one was continuing to collect samples and to test. And eventually they found this genetically engineered bacteria variety everywhere that they tested, everywhere in the world. And they had a specific marker. They knew it was not a natural version, it was the genetically engineered version, and it went everywhere. So I asked Elaine Ingham what would have happened if her graduate student hadn't found that there was death among the wheat sprouts, and they released it to see how far it would spread. Well, this is a sobering reality. The natural consequence is that it could have theoretically displaced the natural Klebsiella planticola and destroyed everything that was around it, all the plant matter, which means terrestrial plants. So this was beyond catastrophe. This could have been a cataclysm, and we were 2 weeks away. Then there's another, and this is covered in the short film, which we are going to release in early 2021. Then there is another variety, let's find that, where they genetically engineered Pseudomonas syringae. Now, Pseudomonas syringae is naturally found in the atmosphere, and it creates rain, and it creates frost and snow. And they genetically engineered a variety to become impotent, and they wanted to spread it on crops so that the crops would not develop frost, because it's this Klebsiella, not Klebsiella, this Pseudomonas syringae that allows the frost to develop at higher temperatures. But it turns out, and they were stopped because it could have also created super weeds that were normally killed by the frost, and it would have been an environmental disaster if the weeds, like pigweed, had survived through the winter. But now we know about this ability to create clouds with this particular bacterium. And if it had been released and it displaced the normal version, it could have altered the weather patterns forever. Knowing all of this, it is a bit of an alarm that Pivot Bio has probably already released genetically modified microbes for soil remediation and fertilizer in the United States, and Join Bio, which works with Bayer, which was bought Monsanto. They're creating probiotics for plants, genetically engineered, and they could end up perhaps swapping genes with the gut bacteria or creating some kind of catastrophe or cataclysm on their own. Now, gene editing is the big poster child of genetic engineering now because it's so cheap and easy. You can buy a do-it-yourself kit on Amazon for $169, so everyone could be a genetic engineer. Now, here's an example of cows that were genetically engineered to be hornless, and they wanted to stuff a lot of cows together in factory farms. They didn't want them to hurt themselves by having, horns in nearby cows. So they created an edited, genetically engineered cow variety that the horns would not grow. And they were so excited about this that in the article that they published the results, an accompanying article said, a letter said, "This proves that gene editing is easy, it has no side effects, therefore no regulation is necessary whatsoever for gene editing." And this was 2016. In 2019, the FDA was just testing a method for sequencing genes, and they decided to use the data from the cows. So they wasn't that it was a requirement, they just decided to use the data, which the scientists had said had proven that there was no side effects. Well, it turns out there were. They found serious problems, and what they found out was that part of the gene that was inserted, the gene editing mechanism was put into bacteria that entered the cow's genome. So they ended up with cows whose genome included bacterial genes. And the bacterial genes created antibiotic resistance. So that means the theory was that if you made these cows, you could be promoting antibiotic resistant pathogens in the cows, in the environment, in humans. Now, it's important to understand what gene editing is. So if you genetically engineer normally, you take a gene gun and you shoot genes into a plate of cells, or you'd use bacteria to smuggle those genes into the cells, then you clone those cells into a plant. You don't know where those genes end up, and it causes damage. With gene editing, you insert basically two little animated figures, let's call them that. One hunts for a particular sequence in the genome, and when it finds it, it alerts its friend, make the cut. It's a scissors, cut there. So when you do that, it cuts it, and then the natural repair mechanism of the cell will immediately go, oh my God, the DNA is cut, join them. Now, when it joins them, you could set it up so that it might insert more material, it might knock something out, but you don't have complete control as to how the cells will join. And sometimes the cells will grab DNA from the environment and just push it in, thinking, oh, this must be mine, this must be mine. And that's what happened. There was bacterial genes that had these two animated figures, the search and destroy and the cutter, and they were near, and they also had antibiotic resistant genes. And so when the cells were recombining, they just grabbed some of this DNA material and stuffed it in to the cell, which was the basic cell that they cloned these animals from. So every single cell in these cows has this antibiotic resistant gene. So that's very dangerous for human health. Now, a similar thing happened when they were genetically engineering mice. They found that they were using a serum in the petri dish that had come from cows or goats. And there was a little bit of DNA floating around in these petri dishes. So when the cells rejoined the cut DNA, it added bovine or goat DNA, as well as bacterial DNA, including retroviruses. You know, retroviruses includes HIV. So this is a way that we can end up with diseases added from gene editing. Also, gene editing is not so safe, and it doesn't work so well. They found that CRISPR, which is the most, touted new inexpensive gene editing mechanism, it was just awarded the Nobel Prize, the two people who created it. It turns out it doesn't work all the time. Like, they use it to stop genes, to knock them out. So they have a search and destroy. Let's find this little code and we'll cut there and we'll knock out the gene. It turns out when they actually finally tested to see if it was working, it didn't work 1/3 of the time. But most of the scientists that used CRISPR to knock out genes never test to see if it worked. They just assumed that it did. So when one company genetically engineered mushrooms to knock out the gene that causes brownness when you cut them, so you could have brown-free mushrooms, they never tested to see if in fact it worked. But in the previous research, which we just looked at, they find that sometimes it didn't work and sometimes it causes the gene to produce a protein that is truncated. When you produce a truncated gene, that could be a toxin or an allergen. And because in the United States, gene-edited GMOs do not require any overview from the United States, these mushrooms could be introduced into the marketplace without any labeling, without any government oversight, without the company even looking to see if the gene editing worked, and it could be causing death and disease. And this is just one of many reasons why gene editing is dangerous. We talked about how it can grab other DNA from the environment. It can cause cuts in other places. It can cause cuts up and down the DNA. It can cause mutations up and down the DNA. It's very dangerous. And here's a company that created a canola that they created with their version of gene editing. And they're saying, well, because it had no foreign genes, we're not even going to call it a GMO. We'll call it non-GMO. So they're blatantly lying to all of us. And then it turns out, and I won't go into the details here, they were lying to regulators as well. And they're just trying to get their product on the market by circling around EU law and consumer concern. They're kind of desperate, and they are, at least we can say, not so ethical. Now, gene drives are a new version that's also out there, a new version of GMO 2.0. Normally, when you have inheritance, you can see the green and the black. So half of the offspring have green on the left side and half have just the black. So it's like, you get the eyes from the mother or the nose from the father, and the trait tends to be, it's thinned out because you can see the green is just being passed on to each generation. But with gene drives, you insert not only a new gene, but you insert a mechanism so that the offspring gets the mechanism and the offspring gets the mechanism, and that mechanism forces it onto both chromosomes. And so it turns out all the offspring get your trait. Anytime any gene drive organism mates, all of the offspring get the trait. Well, so they can force a dramatic and permanent change through the gene pool. And one of the things they want to do is to use this to wipe out species. Let's wipe out rats on islands. Let's wipe out mosquitoes. Well, it's obviously, how did those rats get on the islands in the first place? From the hulls of ships. What happens if it gets spread into a continent and wipes out an entire species? Or it turns out that the technology is it's leaky. So the gene drive could end up being passed on to a different species. Or maybe, since the process of genetic engineering causes unpredictable side effects, maybe it's passing on something else that was never anticipated. And once it's gone, it's out. It's been released. So there's nothing you can do about it. They're trying to genetically engineer environments now, not just organisms. So imagine everything on this farm, from the soil to the sprays, to the chickens, to the animals, to the crops, can be genetically engineered. Now, here's another variety, Hegas. That's under development by the Department of Defense, where they take genetically engineered viruses, put them into insects, so they can release the insects so they can do genetic engineering in the field. I'm sure nothing bad will go wrong then when you have viruses that are genetically engineered, released and being flown around by insects. Digital DNA is a new frontier where you don't need to start with a genome of any animal. You can just create from scratch. And with genome reading, which allows you to then affect different animals or create either new genes from scratch or to go into a particular organism and change it. As of 2015, there were 2,500 high throughput instruments and 1,000 sequencing centers in 55 countries. Well, here's the prediction. If one base pair was a grain of sand in 2015, that would fill up one silo. 10 years later, by 2025, you'd have 154 football stadiums full of data. I don't know what a zetabase is of genome sequencing, but it's 1,000 million trillion. So we're talking about astronomical data that they can use to reprogram the code of life. And remember, we can buy now a $169 do-it-yourself kit on Amazon and become genetic engineers in our basement. The power of that's going to go up, the price is going to go down, and we can combine artificial intelligence with genetic engineering. So we can have massive robotics filling up facilities all powered by AI, so we can have thousands and thousands and thousands of new genes produced very, very easily for use in all sorts of applications. And one of those applications is synbio, or biosynthesized ingredients. And that's where you take a gene and you insert it into, let's say, yeast, and you produce that protein from the gene because it has some desired trait. So they're already doing this. Evolva is a company in Switzerland, and they are talking about creating caffeine, opiates, chocolate, sandalwood, stevia, saffron, mint, all of these. So we don't need to go to the plants. We'll just find the protein we're looking to create and stick it in yeast and produce these proteins, which can then be marketed in instead of the actual saffron. So you can wipe out completely the entire ecosystem and method of making money by the people that have been creating the saffron, and it can create side effects. In the 1980s, there was a similar synbio microproduction laboratory used to create L-tryptophan, and it created contaminants, and that killed about 100 Americans and caused 5,000 to 10,000 to fall sick or become permanently disabled. And they're not testing for those type of changes. If you want to know what's already out there, you can go to SynBioWatch, which has a database, and you can see what kind of things you want to avoid. Eating organic will avoid these things, and that's my recommendation. There are potatoes and apples on the marketplace that are genetically engineered with RNA that changes gene expression. And if you eat those potatoes or apples, it could theoretically reprogram your gene expression. We saw this happen with honeybees. They ate a single meal of RNA, double-stranded RNA. It was supposed to have no effect. And when they checked out the gene expression over the next few weeks, about 10% of their genome had changed their levels of expression from this single meal of RNA, double-stranded RNA that had come from a different species. So if we eat the apple or potato, then it may end up changing our gene expression as well. But if we're not even eating it, if we just happen to be near where they're using RNA interference sprays, which is another way that they're using this technology, if it happens to get on our system and our skin, it might reprogram our gene expression as well. And changes in the RNA, or changes by the RNA, can be passed on to future generations. Now, even Roundup, which is on most current GMOs, the GMO Roundup Ready crops, this one fella injected Roundup into pregnant mice and found that the mice fared okay, their offspring fared okay. The grandchildren didn't do so well, and the great-grandchildren were the most affected, with 90% getting serious diseases. Why? Because it was inheritable. He found the altered substance or trait on the sperm, passed down from one generation to the other, starting when the pregnant mouse was injected with Roundup. This is the man. You can see Dr. Michael Skinner's interview with me at the Institute for Responsible Technology's Facebook page. I think it was in May 2020 or 2019. The most common result of genetic engineering is surprise side effects. And unfortunately, when you release a GMO into the environment, there's no recall. When they genetically engineered corn to be accepting Roundup, then there were more than 200 proteins and metabolites that were significantly altered, including putrescine and cadaverine, which are responsible for the smell of rotting dead bodies. They're also linked to cancer and allergies. And this was a side effect of genetic engineering. This is another side effect in rats that ate genetically modified potatoes. And it turns out that there was potentially precancerous cell growth in their stomach lining as a result of the process of genetic engineering. Glyphosate itself causes all of these problems. It depletes minerals, can damage the microbiome, cause cancer, leaky gut, damage the mitochondria, cause birth defects, damage neurotransmitters and hormones. It interferes with detoxification. It's passed on to future generations. These are all based on either conclusive studies or high probability. And that could explain some of the results that we're getting from GMOs right now. So I'm going to go through some information very quickly about the current GMOs in case some of you are still not eating organic. This is a survey results of people, 3,256 people who reported getting better from 28 different conditions. And you can see those conditions. You can look at those amazing common diseases that people say they're getting better from when they switch to non-GMO and organic. Not just diseases, but disorders, fatigue, being underweight, overweight, allergies, etc. We're seeing the same changes in pets and livestock when they switch to non-GMO or organic. And we see lab animals, when they're force-fed GMOs or Roundup, they develop precursors to many of these diseases. But we also see disease rates. And I'm going to go through this quickly. I always like to share this because by the end, most people have decided to change their diets. Okay, if you look, that's the amount of glyphosate, which is the chief poison in Roundup that's sprayed on corn and soy in the United States. So it's the amount of glyphosate. Also, it indicates how much of the corn and soy was genetically engineered. And this disease is inflammatory bowel disease. And you can see there is a correlation. It doesn't prove causation, but when you understand all the other pieces in the puzzle, that we have plausible causative pathways as to why glyphosate or GMOs could cause these diseases, this becomes important data. I'm just going to fly through 30 slides very quickly. I'm just going to read the diseases. You can look at the slopes and the alarm bell might go off in some of you. This is deaths from intestinal infection. This is inflammatory disease called peritonitis. This is acute death from kidney disease. This both has the percentage of GMO soy and corn and the glyphosate applied to corn and soy. Some of them have that as 2 lines as well as just out of 1. This is hospitalization from acute kidney injury. Hepatitis C. Autism in 6-year-olds, very tight correlation, 0.9972 as opposed to a 1, which would be perfect. Diabetes. This is deaths from stroke. Dementia diagnoses. Deaths from dementia. Deaths from Alzheimer's. Deaths from Parkinson's. Deaths from obesity. Deaths from hypertension. Anemia. Insomnia, sleep disorders, celiac, birth defects, deaths from lipoprotein metabolism disorders, anxiety, suicide by overdose, schizophrenia, ADHD, breast cancer. New information links Roundup to breast cancer. New information labels glyphosate as a probable human carcinogen, and it's found to coordinate or link to liver and bile duct cancer, kidney and pelvic cancer. urinary and bladder cancer, thyroid cancer, deaths from acute myeloid leukemia. And you should know that if you're trying to avoid Roundup, which could be responsible for a lot of that, you can't just avoid GMOs because it is sprayed on crops just before harvest to dry them down. If you go to responsibletechnology.org, which is one of the websites you took a photo of earlier, you can get a database of which crops and foods have high levels of glyphosate if you can't get organic. Organic does not allow the use of Roundup or GMOs. That's the best choice. If you go to secretingredientsmovie.com, I did not give you that to write down earlier, so you can take a picture of this. You can watch a film that I did with Amy Hart of families that get better from serious diseases when they switch to organic food. And mice, by the way, and other animals will avoid GMOs when given a choice in so many instances. If you go to protectnaturenow.com, you can ignore the text for now. Just go to protectnaturenow.com, sign up to get information. That way you'll get the announcement of the new film that becomes available that you saw the trailer for. If you go to livehealthybewell.com, there's a blog, there's other materials there. You can watch Secret Ingredients and get help with switching to organic. If you go to responsibletechnology.org, you can get an interview with Brent Wisner there, an amazing interview. He did the trials, the Monsanto trials on Roundup. They're absolutely dramatic stories. I love these interviews, highly recommend them. And please donate when you're in responsibletechnology.org. Please donate so that we can do our job. And I'm going to share with you, actually, let's do two things. Let's start here first. IRT has been extremely successful. Let me stop sharing here for a second. IRT has been extremely successful at educating people about the health dangers of GMOs and Roundup. I could have spent my full hour just on the GMOs and Roundup. Maybe some of you have seen me do that. And virtually everyone in the room decides to change their diet. And we pioneered the behavior change messaging. I was involved in GMOs starting in 1996 when no one knew what they were. And none of the other nonprofit organizations were focusing on the health dangers. And I considered that to be a mistake. And so that was what compelled me to get involved, because I saw this strategy that was not being used. And now 51% of Americans believe that GMOs are not safe. So we pioneered the messaging, built a campaign, built a movement. I gave 1,000 lectures in 45 countries and trained 1,500 people to speak on GMOs, organized over 10,000 activists, have 2 books and 4 movies, and the whole organization. And we've been very successful in helping move the needle. So most food companies now are in the process of replacing GMO ingredients. And it's a slow process for some of them. Some are still holding back, but the tipping point has started. We're pivoting now. With this new existential threat, we have a plan, and which we're going to launch at the beginning of 2021, which we think is going to stop this existential threat. I don't want to go into the details now because I don't want to tip my hand, but I want you to participate, please, in this opportunity. Go to protectnaturenow.com and sign up. We will let you know when the film is released. We will give you more educational opportunities, more assets that you can understand this, and we'll give you a very specific plan and program where you can help protect nature now and stop this existential threat. And I'm very confident we will do so. But I'm not going to give you the details to give you that confidence. I'm just going to say we've been very successful so far in our other program of movement building. We're starting a new movement now. And the main thing we need right now is financial support. So if you can go to responsibletechnology.org and make a donation for the Institute for Responsible Technology, we have a very large budget we need to fill because we need to do this all over the world. We can't just do this in the United States. Genetically engineered organisms introduced anywhere can spread. We all saw how microbes can spread, whether they're GMO or not. Through COVID, we need to do something immediately and global, and we have a plan. Now, it's interesting that during the COVID pandemic, I was aware that this was kind of like a phased transition for individuals. I need to change my life. I need to change my diet. I need to stop being so stressed when I get my life back. People started reviewing and renewing and reprioritizing their lives. And consciousness, in my opinion, is not local or linear. It operates as a system. There's plenty of evidence for that, pretty irrefutable evidence if you do some digging. And I realized it looks like consciousness for society is in a phase transition. Phase transitions are magical moments, opportunities where you can leap forward into a new reality, not just plug along A, B, C, D, E, F, G, but go to Z as a system. And so I created a magnificent new normal, which is a program which is released now. If you go to amagnificentnewnormal.com, you'll catch the tail end of it, where I interviewed 40 thought leaders and world changers. There's Bruce Lipton and Tom O'Brien and Eben Alexander. There's a lot of huge. Just go to amagnificentnewnormal.com and sign up and catch. You can, because everyone who's released, their video is on for 7 days. So even if if you're just doing it, going there today, you can still watch 6 or 7 different interviews because they're still on for 7 days. And then if there's a replay of this, we'll let you know when you're on that list. It's a different list than the others. And the reason I'm showing it is because when I talk to all these amazing speakers, they all see a new reality for consciousness, going from the classical separation, classical physics, separation, reductionistic thinking to holistic unified understanding. And if you think about the problem of GMOs or any of the other existential threats we're facing, they come out of separate reductionist thinking where people put blinders on and they're very distant from each other. They're certainly distant from nature. They're distant from the future. And that's where they can make these small, petty decisions that can damage all living beings and all future generations. So this is a more spiritual, yet scientific and indigenous wisdom prophesied opportunity. There's so much information in this incredible 40-day program. It gives me enthusiasm and hope that we're not just looking at the normal human consciousness going forward, but we have a possibility to leap forward individually and collectively at this time, which would be the antidote to this existential threat and so many others. I don't have time to go fully into detail of what I learned from these amazing people and why I'm so confident. But please catch them, catch the ones that you can. One interview, you'll be able to catch right now several of them on the tail end, and we may be able to replay it for you soon. So please go to magnificentnewnormal.com for the really good news. Well, that's my presentation. I hope that you appreciate that we are now at a time in human history, an inevitable time, where we can easily recode the streams of life and the streams of evolution for all time. And that this means that we can replace nature so that future generations have the capacity, or let's just say this, they won't have the capacity to inherit the products of the billions of years of evolution, but instead the products of laboratory creations whose number one most common result is surprise side effects. So we need to steward creation, to steward nature like never before. We need a wider awareness, a bigger lens. So we need to make it happen by locking down regulations for sure, and also awakening to a higher quality of awareness as a society where these type of mistakes are not continued, because the technology that we have is so powerful that we can have a negative influence for all living beings and all future generations for the first time as a species. So we need to steward and protect nature now. Thank you all very much.